When FBI agent Elena Davis goes undercover as a historian to investigate a series of mysterious artifact thefts, she uncovers more than missing relics. She discovers a vast conspiracy to alter history itself. Facing prejudice, betrayal, and dangerous forces determined to keep the truth hidden, Elena must decide who she can trust in a race against time to stop the manipulation of history. But as the conspiracy unravels, she realizes the stakes are higher than she ever imagined. Her life and the very fabric of the past are on the line. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The Institute's towering, sterile white walls loomed over Elena Davis as she entered the building for her first day of work. The Historical Research Institute was known for its prestige, a place where the most brilliant historians and curators gathered to study ancient artifacts and rare texts. To the world, it was a beacon of knowledge and enlightenment, but to Elena, it represented something much more complex. She was an undercover FBI agent, sent to infiltrate the Institute under the guise of a historian to investigate a series of thefts involving valuable artifacts. Her mission was delicate. One wrong move could compromise everything. But from the moment she stepped through the Institute's doors, Elena felt the coldness that greeted her. It wasn't just the air conditioning humming through the hallways. It was the way the other researchers and staff glanced at her with polite disinterest, as if she were merely a temporary nuisance rather than a fellow expert. They didn't know her real purpose, of course, but the lack of warmth was something she had expected. What she hadn't expected, however, was how quickly the subtle prejudices would begin to surface. Dr. Davis, a man's voice cut through the quiet hum of the main lobby as Elena adjusted her ID badge. She turned to see Dr. Caldwell, one of the Institute's senior researchers, approaching her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He extended his hand in greeting, though the formality in his tone was unmistakable. "Welcome to the team. We're excited to have you assisting us." "Thank you, Dr. Caldwell," Elena replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt, a question mark that lingered just beneath the surface. "I'm looking forward to contributing." Dr. Caldwell's smile faltered for a split second, as if the word contributing unsettled him. "Yes, well, I'm sure you'll find it quite different here. We have a certain standard of accuracy that we adhere to. I'm sure your experience will be beneficial once you're up to speed with our methods." Elena resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She'd seen this behavior before, the subtle condescension, the quiet undercurrent of disbelief that someone like her, a woman of color, could be just as capable, if not more so, than her colleagues. She had been trained to spot prejudice in all its forms, and Dr. Caldwell was no exception. He wasn't overtly hostile, but his tone carried the weight of low expectations. "Of course," Elena said, keeping her voice neutral. She wasn't here to challenge egos, at least not yet. She had a job to do, and being antagonistic wouldn't get her any closer to solving the case. After a few more pleasantries, Dr. Caldwell excused himself, and Elena made her way to her temporary office. The Institute had provided her with a small space, tucked away from the main research areas, where she could work undisturbed. It wasn't much, but it would suffice for her purposes. The stolen artifacts were the real focus, and she had plenty of ground to cover. Elena sat down at her desk and opened the first file on the list. The missing items were all part of an exhibit on early civilizations, relics that had been recently unearthed and were in the process of being cataloged by the Institute. The thefts had been gradual, small pieces going missing over the course of several months, and no one had noticed until a particularly valuable piece, a ceremonial mask from a lost culture, had disappeared. Her mission was to find out who was behind the thefts, but that wasn't the only part of the case that troubled her. The artifacts themselves had historical significance that challenged widely accepted narratives about ancient civilizations. They hinted at a deeper, more complex history, one that some people might not want revealed. As Elena sifted through the reports, her thoughts wandered back to the initial briefing she'd received at the FBI. The stolen items were believed to have been taken not for personal gain, but for their historical implications. Someone was trying to rewrite history by erasing key pieces of evidence. The question was, Who? Elena's phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her supervisor, reminding her to check in regularly. She responded with a quick message and then leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She had to stay focused. This wasn't just another assignment. It was about protecting history itself. Later that afternoon, Elena attended her first staff meeting. The room was filled with senior researchers and historians, all of whom seemed to know each other well. The atmosphere was cordial, but there was an underlying current of exclusivity. As the only new face in the room, Elena could feel the weight of their gazes. She was an outsider, and they made no effort to hide it. "Let's get started," Marcus, the Institute's lead curator, said as he took his place at the head of the table. His presence was commanding, his voice deep and authoritative. He barely acknowledged Elena as he began discussing the upcoming projects and research initiatives. As the meeting progressed, Elena found herself growing more and more frustrated. Every time she tried to contribute, her comments were either ignored or politely brushed aside. It was as if her voice didn't matter, as if her expertise was irrelevant. And it wasn't just the men. Some of the women in the room were equally dismissive, their expressions cold and indifferent. By the end of the meeting, Elena's patience was wearing thin. She knew she was here for a reason, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine her. As the others filed out of the room, she stayed behind, determined to speak with Marcus. "Mr. Grant?" she called after him. He paused, turning to face her with a raised eyebrow. "I wanted to discuss the artifact catalog. I've been going through the files and I noticed a few discrepancies in the documentation." Marcus sighed, clearly not in the mood for an extended conversation. "Dr. Davis, I'm sure whatever you found is interesting, but we have a team of experts handling the catalog. I suggest you focus on your assigned tasks for now." "I understand that," Elena said, her voice steady. "But these discrepancies could be important. They might explain how some of the artifacts were stolen." For a moment, Marcus's expression softened, but only slightly. "I'll look into it," he said before turning and walking away. Elena watched him leave, a knot of frustration tightening in her chest. She was trying to help, but no one seemed to care. It wasn't just about the thefts anymore. It was about the way they saw her. And she wasn't going to let that stop her. Elena sat at her desk, flipping through pages of the artifact files, but her mind wasn't on the documents in front of her. The resistance she faced at the Institute had become more obvious with each passing day. It wasn't just Dr. Caldwell's dismissiveness or Marcus's cold indifference. There was a pervasive undercurrent of prejudice that lingered in the air, a quiet but constant reminder that she was an outsider here. The whispering behind her back, the sideways glances, the subtle eye rolls, all of it added up to something Elena had grown all too familiar with throughout her career. She knew what it was to be judged for her skin before her intellect, for her background before her qualifications. It had happened before, and it was happening again now. But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about her ability to prove herself as a historian or even as an investigator. This time, it was about something much larger: the truth. The stolen artifacts represented not just missing pieces of history, but a deliberate attempt to erase that history. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the discrimination she was facing here was just a reflection of that larger issue. There were people in the world who wanted to control the narrative, to shape history in their image, and they would do whatever it took to ensure that the truth remained buried. It wasn't just about prejudice, it was about power. "Elena," a voice broke her train of thought. She looked up to see Marcus standing in her doorway, his expression as stern as ever. "Marcus," she said, her tone neutral, "what can I do for you?" He stepped into her office, glancing briefly at the stack of files on her desk before meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said in the meeting yesterday, about the discrepancies in the artifact catalog." Elena raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor. "And I reviewed the documentation myself," he continued, leaning against the doorframe. "You're right, there are some inconsistencies. But it doesn't mean anything. These things happen all the time in historical research. A missing date here, a misplaced reference there. It's not unusual." It's not just a few mistakes, Marcus, Elena said, standing up from her desk and crossing the room to stand in front of him. These discrepancies are too specific to be random. They point to something deliberate, something intentional. Marcus's expression hardened. You're suggesting someone within the Institute is involved in the thefts? I'm saying it's a possibility, Elena replied, refusing to back down. And if we don't look into it, we're never going to find out who's behind this. For a long moment, Marcus was silent, his eyes searching hers as if trying to gauge how serious she was. Then, with a sigh, he shook his head. I don't think you understand how things work here, Elena. This is one of the most respected research institutes in the world. We're not some backwater museum with lax security and disorganized records. If something like this were happening under our noses, we would know about it. Would you? Elena challenged, crossing her arms. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like a lot of people here are more concerned with protecting their reputations than with finding the truth. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elena thought he might lash out at her. But instead, he simply turned and walked toward the door. Watch yourself, Elena, he said over his shoulder. You're new here, and you don't want to make enemies. With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Elena exhaled, her heart racing. She hadn't expected Marcus to agree with her, but his thinly veiled threat still stung. She had known from the beginning that her mission here would be difficult, but she hadn't realized just how much resistance she would face from the very people she was trying to protect. Shaking off her frustration, Elena returned to her desk and pulled out her phone. She needed to check in with her FBI supervisor and update them on the situation. As she dialed the number, she thought about Marcus's words. You don't want to make enemies. But the truth was, she already had. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Agent Davis, her supervisor said, his tone brisk and professional. What's your status? I've uncovered some discrepancies in the artifact catalog, Elena began, keeping her voice low. I believe someone within the Institute is involved in the thefts, but I don't have any hard evidence yet. The resistance I'm facing here is strong. No one wants to admit there's a problem. Keep digging, her supervisor instructed. We need solid proof before we can move forward. And be careful, if there's someone on the inside, they'll be watching you. I understand, Elena said, glancing around her office as if expecting someone to be listening. I'll keep you updated. After hanging up, Elena sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. The weight of the investigation pressed down on her, and she felt the familiar ache of isolation creeping in. Being undercover was always lonely, but this time it felt more personal. The prejudices she faced weren't just a professional barrier, they were a reminder of the societal walls she had been fighting her whole life. That evening, as Elena left the Institute, she found herself replaying the day's events in her mind. The cold stares, the dismissive comments, Marcus's warning, it all felt like an uphill battle, but she wasn't going to let it stop her. Walking to her car, she noticed a shadow move in the distance. She paused, her instincts kicking in. Was someone watching her? She scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. As she drove home, the darkened streets seemed to close in on her, and the weight of the investigation settled heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being followed, though every time she glanced in her rearview mirror, the road was empty. By the time she arrived at her apartment, Elena was on edge. She quickly locked the door behind her and double-checked the windows before collapsing onto her couch. She needed rest, but sleep felt like a distant luxury. For a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on her journey. She had worked hard to get here, to be seen as more than just a woman of color in a field dominated by old prejudices. But no matter how far she climbed, it seemed the barriers never disappeared. They just shifted, growing more subtle, more insidious. And yet, Elena knew she couldn't give up. The artifacts she was chasing weren't just stolen objects. They were pieces of a larger story, one that had been ignored for too long. And the people who wanted that story to stay buried were willing to do whatever it took to keep it hidden. As Elena lay in the dark, the weight of her mission settled over her. She was up against more than just a criminal network. She was up against history itself and the forces that sought to control it. and she wasn't about to let them win. The Institute felt different today. There was a hum of activity, people moving about with more urgency, more whispers exchanged in the hallways. Elena noticed it the moment she walked in. The tension was palpable, and she couldn't help but wonder if her investigation was starting to unearth things that made people nervous. If someone in the Institute was responsible for the thefts, the cracks were beginning to show. Elena had spent the night going over the artifact files, combing through every detail she could find. Something about the pattern of the thefts had been nagging at her. It wasn't just about the stolen pieces, it was about what they represented. These artifacts weren't just rare. They challenged the dominant narrative of ancient history, suggesting that some of the world's most celebrated discoveries might not have been as unique as they seemed. That's why they were being targeted, stolen away, and potentially erased. As she sat at her desk, reviewing her notes, a sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Dr. Caldwell standing in the doorway, his face drawn tight with a strange mix of curiosity and irritation. "Dr. Davis," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." Elena stood, motioning for him to enter. "What's going on?" Dr. Caldwell stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I don't know what you're digging into, but it's starting to make people uncomfortable. You've been asking too many questions, and it's raising concerns." "Concerns?" Elena repeated, feeling her pulse quicken. "I'm doing my job, Dr. Caldwell. I'm here to ensure the security of these artifacts, and that means investigating the inconsistencies in the records." "Be that as it may," Caldwell said, fidgeting slightly, "you need to tread carefully. This institute has a reputation to uphold. These artifacts are tied to significant historical claims, and any scandal could ruin that." Elena narrowed her eyes. "Are you saying we should ignore the thefts to protect the institute's reputation?" Caldwell hesitated for a moment, his face hardening. "What I'm saying is that not everything is as it seems. People in this building have worked their entire careers to preserve these artifacts, to build the stories that the world believes. Sometimes things get misfiled, lost. It happens." It was clear to Elena now. Caldwell was trying to protect something, or someone. His evasiveness only confirmed her suspicions that there were deeper forces at play. But what? Before she could press further, Caldwell stood up abruptly. "Just be careful, Dr. Davis. This place has its own ways of handling things." He left before Elena could respond, leaving her more unsettled than before. The encounter only fueled her determination. She had to keep digging. Someone in the Institute was hiding something, and she was going to find out what. That afternoon, Elena headed to the archives. The Institute's basement was a labyrinth of shelves and locked cabinets, filled with centuries-old records, forgotten relics, and dusty ledgers that hadn't been touched in years. If there was any trace of who was behind the thefts, it would be buried down here. As she walked down the narrow corridors between rows of shelves, she felt the cold chill of the underground seeping into her bones. The faint buzz of the overhead lights added to the eerie silence, making the space feel oppressive. But Elena had learned long ago that places like this held secrets waiting to be uncovered. She found the section she was looking for, a row of old ledgers, handwritten records cataloging the Institute's acquisitions over the years. Many of these artifacts had been donated by private collectors, wealthy patrons with their own interests in preserving or controlling history. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something strange. Several entries were missing, whole sections of the catalog erased or deliberately altered. Her heart raced as she scanned the names of the donors. A particular name jumped out at her: Lawrence Whitmore, a prominent philanthropist who had donated millions to the Institute. Whitmore had made his fortune through international trade and investments in historical preservation projects. He was one of the Institute's biggest supporters, but the missing entries seemed to coincide with some of his largest donations. It was as if someone had been covering up a trail. Elena took out her phone and snapped pictures of the pages for her records. There was no way she could confront anyone with this yet. But it was a lead. A solid lead. If Whitmore was involved in the thefts, or worse, in altering the historical record, it could blow the case wide open. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Elena froze, her pulse spiking. She hadn't heard anyone else come into the archives. Quickly, she slid the ledger back onto the shelf and turned toward the source of the noise. A figure emerged from around the corner, and Elena's heart sank as she recognized Marcus. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Elena straightened up, her mind racing for a plausible explanation. "I was reviewing some of the older records, looking for any patterns in the donations tied to the artifacts." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And you just happened to be down here in the deepest part of the archives alone?" She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, I'm thorough. It's my job." There was a long pause as Marcus stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to Elena's surprise, he nodded slightly. "I see. Just be careful. These archives are not easy to navigate. It's easy to get lost in the paperwork, and you don't want to go chasing the wrong shadows." It was an odd warning, but Elena knew better than to trust his seemingly casual tone. Marcus had been skeptical of her from the start, but now he seemed almost concerned. Was he in on it, or was he just another pawn in the Institute's larger game? She decided to push her luck. "Marcus, do you think there's more going on here than just the thefts? Don't you find it strange that no one seems interested in solving this?" Marcus's eyes darkened. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You need to understand something, Elena. This institute was built on history. Not just the preservation of it, but the control of it. People like Caldwell and even Whitmore, they have interests that go beyond just protecting these artifacts. They have invested too much to let a few missing items jeopardize their legacy." "Are you saying they're involved?" Elena asked, her pulse quickening. "I'm saying they'll do whatever it takes to protect what they've built," Marcus replied cryptically. "And if you're not careful, you could get caught in the crossfire." Elena stared at him, trying to read between the lines. Marcus wasn't giving her the full story, but he was warning her nonetheless. There was a hidden agenda at play, and it went deeper than she had imagined. The thefts were only the tip of the iceberg. As Marcus turned to leave, Elena called after him. "Why are you telling me this?" He paused, his back to her. "Because I've been here long enough to know when something's wrong, and I'm starting to think you might be the only one willing to do something about it." With that, he disappeared down the corridor, leaving Elena standing in the dimly lit archive room, her mind reeling. For the first time since she'd arrived at the Institute, she felt a glimmer of hope. Marcus had given her more than he realized. He had confirmed her suspicions that the Institute wasn't just a victim of theft. It was a player in a much larger game. And now she had to figure out how deep the corruption ran. But one thing was clear. She was no longer investigating a simple case of stolen artifacts. She was uncovering a conspiracy to rewrite history itself. The weight of Marcus's cryptic warning hung over Elena as she sat alone in her office later that night, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The Institute had grown quiet, the typical bustle of researchers and staff long gone, leaving only the sound of the ticking clock and her own steady breathing. She stared down at the ledger pages she'd photographed in the archives earlier, her mind racing through every detail Marcus had hinted at. The Institute was hiding something. That much was clear now. The missing artifacts were more than just random thefts. They were part of a deliberate effort to control history, to erase or alter narratives that didn't fit the established view. And it was starting to make sense why her presence here was met with so much resistance. She wasn't just an outsider because of her background. She was an outsider because she was a threat to the very structure that some people had spent their lives building. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from her FBI supervisor. "Status update? Any new leads?" Elena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had new leads, but nothing concrete yet. Whitmore's name, the missing catalog entries, Marcus's warnings, they all pointed to something big. But she didn't have enough evidence to make her case. And with the way things were going, she wasn't sure how much time she had before someone realized how close she was to the truth. She typed out a brief response. "Still investigating. Possible connection to donor Whitmore. Need more time." After sending the message, she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She needed a plan. She couldn't confront Whitmore directly, not without more proof. And she couldn't trust anyone in the Institute, except maybe Marcus, who seemed to be playing his own careful game. As she opened her eyes, a thought occurred to her. The missing artifacts had been part of a series of donations from Whitmore, but they weren't the only pieces tied to his name. There had to be more, items that hadn't been stolen but were still significant. If she could track down those artifacts, maybe she could find something that connected Whitmore to the conspiracy, something that hadn't yet been erased from the records. Elena quickly pulled up the Institute's online catalog and began searching for any mention of Whitmore's donations. She combed through every listing, cross-referencing the pieces with her notes from the archives. After nearly an hour of searching, she found something, a collection of ancient scrolls, part of a larger exhibit that had been carefully curated and displayed in the Institute's East Wing. The scrolls had been added to the collection several years ago. Around the same time, the first of the stolen artifacts had arrived. They were considered rare, valuable pieces that provided insight into a long-lost civilization. And they were still here. Elena grabbed her coat and headed for the East Wing. The East Wing of the Institute was eerily quiet at this time of night. Most of the exhibits were housed in glass cases, dimly lit for the late-night security rounds. Elena made her way past rows of ancient pottery, weathered manuscripts, and meticulously reconstructed artifacts, all while keeping an eye out for the scrolls she had read about. When she finally found them, they were displayed in a large glass case at the center of the room. The scrolls were delicate, their faded ink barely legible under the low lighting. But it wasn't the scrolls themselves that caught Elena's attention. It was the small plaque beneath them, listing Lawrence Whitmore as the primary donor. This was it. Whitmore had a direct connection to these scrolls, and if they were part of the same conspiracy, they might hold clues to what he was trying to hide. Elena scanned the room, making sure she was alone. Then, with quick precision, she pulled out her phone and snapped several photos of the scrolls and the accompanying plaque. She would need to analyze them further to see if there were any discrepancies in the records or any hidden markings that might reveal something deeper. But as she took the last photo, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall behind her. Elena froze, her heart pounding. She quickly slid her phone into her pocket and turned, her pulse racing as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they were heading straight toward her. Within seconds, a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. Marcus. His face was shadowed, but his posture was tense, his movements deliberate as he approached. For a moment, Elena wasn't sure what to expect. Had he followed her here? Was he part of the conspiracy after all? But when he finally reached her, his expression was conflicted, as though he was struggling with something internally. He glanced at the scrolls, then back at her. "You're still chasing this," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you here, Marcus? Did you know I'd be looking into this?" He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were still alone. "I had a feeling. I told you before. There are things going on here that you don't fully understand." "Then help me understand," Elena said, her voice firm. "You've been working here for years. You know what's happening, don't you?" Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "I know enough. Enough to know that this isn't just about missing artifacts. It's about control. These scrolls, the other stolen pieces, they're all part of something bigger. They're not just historical relics. They contain information, stories that challenge the accepted history. And some people don't want those stories to come to light." Elena took a step closer, her mind racing. "Are you saying Whitmore's involved?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Whitmore. And others. He's not the only one who benefits from controlling the narrative. There are people, powerful people, who have a vested interest in keeping certain parts of history hidden, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure the truth stays buried." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Then why haven't you done anything? Why are you still working here if you know all of this?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Because it's not that simple. I've spent my whole life here. This place, it's part of who I am. And until recently, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought we were preserving history, protecting it. But now? He trailed off, his voice heavy with regret. Elena studied him for a moment, her mind racing. Marcus was conflicted, that much was clear. He wasn't directly involved in the thefts, but he had been complicit in allowing them to happen. And now, he was caught between his loyalty to the Institute and his growing realization that the truth needed to come out. "Help me, Marcus," Elena said quietly. "You know more than you're letting on. If we don't expose this, more artifacts will disappear. More history will be lost." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. "There's a storage room," he said, his voice barely audible. "In the West Wing. It's not on the official records, but it's where they keep the pieces they don't want anyone to see. The ones that don't fit the narrative." Elena's heart raced. "Do you have access?" Marcus nodded again, his expression grim. "I can get us in, but we'll need to be careful. If anyone finds out what we're doing, we won't let them," Elena said, determination filling her voice. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Marcus finally looked at her, his gaze steady. "Tomorrow night," he said, "after hours." Elena nodded, her pulse quickening. This was it, the break she'd been waiting for. As Marcus turned to leave, Elena watched him disappear into the shadows, her mind spinning with possibilities. She had finally found an ally, someone who knew the truth and was willing to help her uncover it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere in the depths of the Institute, someone was keeping tabs on her every move, and now the stakes were higher than ever. She had one chance to expose the truth, and if she failed, everything, her career, the artifacts, history itself, could be lost forever. The Institute was cloaked in darkness as Elena and Marcus made their way through the quiet, labyrinthine corridors toward the West Wing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft scuff of their footsteps and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath them. Elena's heart raced, her mind sharp with focus. Tonight would be the night they uncovered the truth. Marcus had arranged for the security cameras in the West Wing to be temporarily disabled, giving them a narrow window of opportunity. But the deeper they ventured into the heart of the Institute, the more Elena could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew what they were doing, that someone was watching. They stopped in front of an unmarked door at the far end of the hallway. It was a door that, by all accounts, wasn't supposed to exist, tucked away in a part of the building rarely accessed by anyone but a select few. Marcus fumbled with a set of keys, his fingers trembling slightly as he worked to unlock the door. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus paused, glancing at her. His face was tight with worry, but there was a determination in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "I'm sure," he said, finally fitting the key into the lock. "This is the only way." With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell leading down into the bowels of the Institute. The air was musty and cold, a stark contrast to the polished, curated atmosphere of the upper floors. Elena swallowed her nerves and followed Marcus down the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. At the bottom, another door awaited them. This one was heavy and reinforced, the kind used in secure storage areas that held the Institute's most valuable items. Marcus pulled out another key, glancing nervously over his shoulder before unlocking the door. As it swung open, Elena's breath caught in her throat. The room was vast, its high ceilings lost in shadow. Shelves upon shelves of artifacts stretched out before them, row after row of relics that had never seen the light of day. There were ancient manuscripts, ceremonial masks, crumbling statues, and boxes sealed shut with wax stamps. The air smelled of dust and old secrets. "This is where they keep them," Marcus said quietly, stepping inside. "The artifacts that don't fit the official narrative. The ones that challenge the accepted history." Elena stared in awe, her mind reeling at the sheer volume of forgotten history stored in this hidden room. She had expected to find a few stolen pieces, maybe even a small stash of unrecorded items, but this was something far bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just a cover-up of thefts, it was an entire operation designed to manipulate history itself. She approached one of the shelves, her fingers brushing against the worn leather bindings of a stack of scrolls. There were no labels, no catalog numbers, just the artifacts themselves, left here to gather dust, forgotten by the world. But they weren't forgotten by everyone. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that these relics remained hidden. These artifacts, Elena said, her voice thick with disbelief, they're all from different cultures, different eras. Why hide them? What's the connection? Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. The connection is power. History is written by those in control, and whoever controls the narrative of the past can shape the present and the future. Whitmore and his associates, they don't want certain truths coming to light. These artifacts, they tell stories that challenge the version of history that people like him have built their careers on. Elena nodded, her suspicions finally confirmed. So the stolen artifacts, they weren't just valuable because they were rare. They were dangerous because they threatened to change the way we understand the past. Exactly, Marcus said, his voice laced with regret. And it's not just Whitmore. There are others, people in high places, who have a vested interest in keeping these artifacts hidden. They've been doing this for years, erasing pieces of history that don't serve their agenda. And anyone who gets too close, well, let's just say they don't stay around for long. Elena's mind raced. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about stolen relics. It was about the deliberate manipulation of historical truth on a global scale. And she had stumbled right into the middle of it. We need to expose this, she said, turning to Marcus. All of it. The public needs to know what's been hidden here. Marcus hesitated, his face clouded with doubt. It's not that simple, Elena. These people, they're powerful. If we go public with this without solid proof, they'll bury us. They'll destroy everything. Then we get the proof, Elena said firmly. We gather as much evidence as we can, and we take it to the authorities. We don't let them bury the truth any longer. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said, his voice steady. But we'll need to be careful. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Elena was about to respond when a sudden noise from behind them made her freeze. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw a shadowed figure standing at the entrance to the storage room. The figure stepped forward, and the dim light from the overhead bulbs revealed a familiar face. Dr. Caldwell. Elena's blood ran cold as she locked eyes with him. His face was twisted with fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You shouldn't have come here, Caldwell said, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. Marcus stepped in front of Elena, his posture tense. Caldwell, listen. No, Caldwell snapped, cutting him off. I'm done listening. Do you have any idea what you've jeopardized by bringing her here? Do you have any idea what's at stake? Elena's mind raced, trying to piece together Caldwell's role in all of this. He wasn't just another complicit figure. He was involved, deeply. But how far did his involvement go? I know exactly what's at stake, Elena said, stepping forward. The truth. You've been hiding it for years, Caldwell, but not anymore. Caldwell laughed, a cold, bitter sound. The truth? You think this is about the truth? This is about survival. History is a weapon, and those who control it control the world. Whitmore understands that. So do the others. You're just a pawn, Elena. A foolish pawn in a game you don't even understand. Elena's jaw tightened. I'm not a pawn, and neither is Marcus. We're going to expose everything. Caldwell's eyes flickered toward Marcus, his expression hardening. You really think you can trust him? After all these years, you think he's on your side? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but Elena didn't waver. He made his choice, she said, her voice firm, and so have I. For a moment, there was only silence as Caldwell glared at them, his mind clearly racing with options. Then, with a sharp movement, he pulled something from his pocket, a small device, no bigger than a key fob. I can't let you leave here, Caldwell said, his voice cold. You've seen too much. Elena's heart pounded as she realized what he was holding, a remote trigger for the security system. One press, and the alarms would go off, locking them in the storage room until security arrived. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Before Caldwell could react, Elena lunged forward, knocking the device from his hand. It clattered to the ground, and in the confusion, Marcus grabbed Caldwell by the arm, wrestling him to the floor. The struggle was brief, but by the time it was over, Caldwell lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his face flushed with anger. Elena quickly retrieved the device, deactivating the security system. "It's over, Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not going to bury this anymore." Marcus stood, his breathing heavy, and looked down at Caldwell with a mixture of anger and pity. "We're going public with this," he said, his voice steady, "and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Caldwell said nothing, his eyes burning with hatred. But Elena knew it didn't matter. They had the proof they needed. The hidden artifacts, the missing records, the connection to Whitmore. It was all there. As they left the storage room, Elena felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had taken the first step toward restoring the truth. The artifacts would be returned, the stolen history would be revealed, and those responsible would be held accountable. And as they walked into the night, Elena knew one thing for certain. History, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to be told. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.